Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lost Media Fire Emblem panel for EmblemCon 2023. My name is Digital Dreams, and I'll be your host and guide on this journey of Lost Media for the Fire Emblem franchise. Throughout the next hour, I'll be telling you about the various Lost Media for the series we have all come to love so much. Hopefully, you'll be able to walk away with more trivia about Fire Emblem, as well as a deeper understanding of Lost Media and how we can uncover these missing pieces of franchise history. Before we get into the deeper segments of this presentation, allow me to introduce myself. If you think my name sounds familiar because you've attended past EmblemCon events, that would be because it is. This is my 6th total presentation for EmblemCon, and I've hosted a presentation every single year. I've done formal presentations about cut content and glitches for the Fire Emblem franchise, and if you want to view them, I have recordings up on my YouTube page. Outside of EmblemCon, I am primarily a writer. I've been writing for Fire Emblem since 2017. And I've done a scripted rewrite of Fire Emblem Fates, a Three Houses fan game script, cut Telia supports, one-shots, and zine pieces. To put it simply, I love Fire Emblem a lot, and I'm incredibly excited to teach you all about the lost media of this franchise. For as much as we have recorded of Fire Emblem's history, there's a lot that continues to elude us, and I want to shine a light on that which we understand very little in this series. Beyond that, I hope to kickstart a few searches for these pieces of lost media so we can hopefully unearth and archive them one day for everyone to see. The recording you are watching right now is a recreation of the panel as it was presented in early May of 2023 for EmblemCon of that year. Unlike with my other recordings, I have changed nothing since the script was first written in April, on account of there being no updates to any of the subjects being addressed here. Many of them are cold cases. The script I'm reading now is down in the description if anyone would like to read it as I'm saying it. Also, like the previous 2 recordings, I'm recording this all in one shot. If I make a mistake, I'm just rolling with it to maintain the spirit of the original presentation. With all of that said, let's get started. Before we go any further, I want to explain a few of the basic details about lost media. First off, what exactly is lost media? Lost media is an umbrella term describing media that is missing or otherwise unavailable to the general public. Any type of media can fall into this definition, whether it be movies, TV shows, music, video games, books, or any other category of media you can think of. As long as it's been made unavailable to the public, it can be considered lost media. There are 4 primary categories of lost media we'll be talking about today. First up is media that has been completely lost. This is media where we have no piece of it available aside from maybe a few pictures and loose fragments of information, and it simply goes by the title of lost. Next we have partially lost, which is media that has been partially found, but some piece of it is still out of the reach of the public. Found media is media that has been completely found and archived for public viewing and use. Last, we have the existence unconfirmed category, which is for media that may or may not exist. There are rumors of it existing, but we have no solid evidence or pictures to prove it. We'll touch on all 4 of these throughout the presentation, though we're mostly going to stay in the realm of the first 2. With all of that out of the way, let's begin with our first piece of lost media. First, we have BS Arcanea Saga from 1997, which has been partially lost. For the unenlightened, BS Arcanea Saga was a series of 4 maps released on the Satellaview add-on for the SNES. The Satellaview allowed players to download content via satellite broadcast during a specific time window. BS Arcanea Saga was broadcast from September 28, 1997 to October 19, 1997, with new chapters weekly for that brief period. Each one was a self-contained adventure and followed a character from Mystery of the Emblem, be it Nina, Minerva, Ricard, or Camo. BS Arcanea Saga had 2 reruns on the Satellaview, one a month after its completion and one in 1999. The maps in BS Arcanea Saga acted as something of a time attack. The objective was to survive the entire broadcast period. Players would have to defeat as many enemies as possible, while capturing certain areas on the map to increase their point total. Opening chests and visiting village would also increase the point total. Each chapter had a lord character who would end the map if they died, and new characters would be recruited through the passage of actual real-world time. It was certainly a departure from the series' gameplay both before and since then. I know what some of you are thinking as I say all of this, though. Don't we have access to the maps of BS Arcanea Saga? How could it be lost media if we have the maps? The answer to that is a bit complicated. We do have the ROMs of these maps that people can play through an admittedly complicated setup, but we don't have access to the original format ROMs from the broadcast back in the 1990s. The Satellaview was discontinued at the turn of the century, and its games fell into obscurity. Even though we have ROMs uploaded online, they're not the original format as the broadcast that started it all. There are videos of these maps on YouTube for anyone interested, but you can't play the exact same maps in the exact same format as the broadcast. That's the catch that makes BS Arcanea Saga partially lost media. We may have ROMs of these maps, but we don't have the original files from the broadcasts of the 1990s. I don't even know how we would go about finding these files, since they were shared in a highly specific way that has been defunct for over 2 decades. To my knowledge, the search for these original files has stalled for this exact reason. Having ROMs of the maps at all is incredible, but we can't help but yearn for everything we're still missing when it comes to the original Satellaview broadcasts. Next up, Fire Emblem has a long history with 4-koma manga. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 4-paneled comics of Awakening and Heroes, but before the Awakening era of manga kicked off, there were many other 4-koma anthologies for the first 6 games of the series, and that brings us to our next piece of lost media. The partially lost 4-koma anthologies released from 1994 to 2002. The 4-koma released throughout the 2010s are well documented and have been archived in many places online. However, the manga for the first 6 games of the series are far more elusive. Back when these manga were released, Fire Emblem was much more niche, and there was less of an effort to preserve them. On top of that, most of the 4-koma were put together by fans rather than being official publications on account of Nintendo. The 4-koma have been long out of print, though there are still some copies circulating online. We have a few raw rips of these earlier 4-koma, but there are still quite a few missing. At this point, the main obstacle at hand is finding a way to buy these manga so someone can upload them online. However, this leads us to the main issue of this search: the language barrier. I am speaking English in this presentation, and English was spoken at the convention, but the search for these manga would need to be conducted on Japanese sites. If someone could track down these 4-koma and upload them, then it would be a relatively simple search to end. Until somebody steps up to finish the job, though, these manga remain partly lost. The good news is that we have a conclusive list of all the manga that needs to be found, and there are pictures of the covers online as well. This list is as follows. All 6 of the manga theater volumes need to be uploaded in full. Volume 4 is completely lost, while the others have some pages available, but not all of them. The 2 Thracia entries in the Gag Battle series have been archived, but we're still missing parts of the genealogy of the Holy War and Binding Blade Gag Battle anthologies. Yaruze Fire Emblem has been completely archived, and the same applies to the first entry of Thracia's manga theater. The second entry is completely lost, though. To finish things off, Genealogy Gag Paradise and Binding Blade Manga Kingdom are partially lost. In other words, we've got a lot of good information here. It's just a matter of putting the plan into motion, putting the plan of buying them in, and the manga and uploading it online into action. There I go with the mistakes again. Someone on the Lost Media Wiki actually said that they bought all of the unarchived manga and claimed they were going to upload it, but so far they've only posted Yaruze out of the bunch. On top of that, they haven't responded to any messages since first posting Yaruze online. Even so, this is one set of lost media that I am fairly confident will be found and archived with enough time, though, especially through community efforts. If the community comes together, we should be able to archive this piece of Fire Emblem history for all to enjoy. There's one other piece of lost manga to discuss before we change gears, though, and that would be the manga for Binding Blade. This manga was released in 2002 and is categorized as partially lost. We have scans of a few pages, but the bulk of this 132-page manga anthology remains missing and inaccessible. The situation for this manga is largely the same as the 4-koma anthologies. We know the manga exists, and there are many listings on Japanese websites for people to purchase it. The book is long out of print, but it's fairly easy to access and buy if you know where to look. However, nobody has scanned and uploaded the manga online, and the lack of public access is what makes it lost media. Once again, this case could be easily solved by someone purchasing the manga and uploading it somewhere it can be archived. This manga is only a single volume too, so that means it should be an even simpler archival process than the 4-koma anthologies once someone buys it. It's also worth noting that this manga has nothing to do with Champion Sword, another manga adaptation of Binding Blade containing original characters not found in the base game. Don't worry, Champion Sword. We'll get to you soon enough. I hope you're not tired of hearing about Binding Blade yet, because we've still got a lot to discuss with this game. This time, though, we're going to actually talk about the game itself rather than just its supplemental material. Binding Blade had an incredibly rocky development process, and it has become infamous among series fans for its difficult creation years. It was released as the first Fire Emblem game on a handheld console, but in truth, it began its life as a game for the Nintendo 64. That first draft of Binding Blade, also known as N64's Maiden of Darkness, is our next piece of lost media, and it's our first fully lost entry in this presentation. The story behind Maiden of Darkness is a long one that first takes us to the year 1997, 1 year after the release of the N64. The game was first mentioned by Shigeru Miyamoto during an interview where he stated that Fire Emblem 64 would be released in the back half of 1998. The game was officially announced in September 1998 as Maiden of Darkness. However, 1998 ended and 1999 began before any other news about Maiden of Darkness came to light. The release date set for 1998 never came, and the series creator Shozo Kaga next spoke of it in January the following year. He claimed Maiden of Darkness was becoming too ambitious for the N64 and said Thracia 776 would be developed next instead. Later in 1999, the Fire Emblem Treasure Book was released, and fans hoped they would finally be able to learn more about Maiden of Darkness after such a prolonged period of silence. However, the book had no information about Maiden of Darkness at all, showing it had been quietly postponed once again. In August of 1999, Kaga left Intelligent Systems just a few days before the release of Thracia 776. This, combined with many other developmental issues that plagued Maiden of Darkness, led to the game being permanently cancelled on September 24th, 2000. We have a bit more information about Maiden of Darkness, even though it never saw an official release. The 25th anniversary book, The Making of Fire Emblem, gave us a bit of information about the game. There's one selection of a script from Maiden of Darkness, as well as a single existing screenshot using the GBA art style for its character sprites. The left sprite bears a resemblance to Pent in terms of facial structure, while he seems to take his hair from Klein. The right character doesn't seem to resemble any GBA characters directly, though I've always gotten Kath vibes from it. The book also gave us a few pictures of character concepts, though most of the characters went unused in the final game. We don't know what the game looked like in action, and most of what we know about it comes from vague interviews and the Making of Fire Emblem book. It's difficult to say if any of Maiden of Darkness survived the scrapping process when it began being reworked into Binding Blade for the Game Boy Advance. Intelligent Systems is at least willing to acknowledge its existence, though, so perhaps they do have some traces of it. It's difficult to say for sure, since so little of Maiden of Darkness was known before and after it was scrapped and left behind. The story of Binding Blade's development doesn't end there, though. Maiden of Darkness may have been the start of the game's rocky development process, but there's a lot more to the story. In fact, there are many other pieces to the story in the form of other early builds of Binding Blade, all of which are fully lost aside from a handful of screenshots to prove they exist. There are a lot of beta builds from Binding Blade. Some of them have names, while others do not. As I just discussed, Maiden of Darkness was the primary build of the game from 1997 to 2000. But there were many other iterations put together between its cancellation in 2000 and the final game's release in 2002. The first beta build of Binding Blade comes from January of 2001, when two pictures were revealed about the game's current development. The first picture came from a Famitsu article showing a dynamic battle screen with the health bars resembling swords. The battle sprites look very different from the final game and depict a female mage casting a spell against Shanna. In the final game, only male versions of enemies are shown in combat, implying there used to be gender equality among the enemy armies. The second screenshot is of Alan with a villager from an issue of Nintendo Power. Interestingly, the sprite of a female mercenary can be seen in the background, a sprite that went unused in all three GBA Fire Emblem games. Once again, this proves the gender equality among the enemy forces theory. Aside from these two pictures, though, very little is known of the January 2001 build, and it was never shown to the public. These pictures are the only proof we have of this version of the game existing. The most well-known beta build is from Space World 2001. Even so, we don't have all that much about it, with the only surviving material being a promotional poster, a magazine photo, a few screenshots, and a low-quality pre-release trailer. There's not really great audio for it, so the audio has been muted, but here's the trailer recorded secondhand. This trailer shows us different UI from the previous build, and it's inching closer to what we see in the final game. The battle screen was heavily simplified in this trailer compared to the sword HP bar from the previous build. A strange fact about this build is that Lelena seems to join in Chapter 1 instead of Chapter 8 as she does in the final game. The weapon icons are all taken from Thracia 776, likely as placeholders. We have two screenshots from this build too, one of a berserker getting a critical hit on a dragon, and another of Roy fighting the game's first boss. The color scheme is very different from the final game too. Speaking of Roy, his design has changed dramatically since the Space World build. He had a different portrait originally, which you can see here. His in-game portrait was changed soon before the release of the game, but his map and battle sprites still use his original design. An interview states this design change was made to appeal to younger children more, though I'm not entirely sure how interested younger children would have been in a war strategy game in the first place. Either way, after the Space World build, we have a slight evolution of that version of the game that shows us early versions of Chapter 2. The UI has changed slightly once again, and the map design of the chapter has shifted as well. The coloration of the mountains is the most obvious change here, and their shading is a bold purple color. It's getting closer to the final game, but we're still not there yet. Next up, we have a build that acts as our first existence unconfirmed from this panel, the English version of Binding Blade. Did you know that Binding Blade was supposed to be the first Fire Emblem game to go international? However, this never came to be, and the project was quietly shelved after its announcement by Nintendo of America. This project was said to happen, but we don't know how far it got into development before being cancelled. It's impossible to say if translation work began at all before the English version was canned, and since we don't know if they ever started development on this incarnation of the game, it remains an existence unconfirmed piece of lost media. If it exists, no proof of its progress has resurfaced, so if it does exist, it is lost. The last build we know about in detail is the Memento Mori build, and this is yet again an existence unconfirmed case. In July of 2008, the owner of the Fire Emblem Universe website got his hands on information from a friend known as Memento Mori. This information is said to have originated from the daughter of an employee at Intelligent Systems who compiled notes about this build. The provided notes are all written in poorly written English, but we can gather a few ideas about the story changes found in this build. First off, Gaul was supposed to be playable with a personal weapon known as the Dragon Spear, a lance with a brave effect. He would be recruitable by Milady and Zeiss. Gaul was not recruitable in the final game, and while he can talk to both Wyvern Riders, he never joins Roy. In this version, Guinevere was also set to be a playable character and act as the secondary lord. Lilina and Thea were supposed to be cousins. I have to wonder if this applies to all the Pegasus sisters, though only Thea was mentioned. This has interesting implications no matter what. Speaking of Lilina, she supposedly had a tome known as Storm that is not found in the final game. Igreen was going to possess dragon blood. Another weapon, the Sea Sword, was meant to be a brave weapon exclusive to mercenaries and heroes. The Binding Blade was meant to be acquired by defeating Zephiel, rather than the complicated guide and chapter process we have come to know over the years. Zephiel and Murdoch were siblings in this build, and Zephiel was confirmed to be in love with Brenya. John was meant to survive Chapter 24 and could be fought in the final battle against Idun. Other Dragon Stones could also be acquired through enemy drops here in the last map. All of this is only rumored, though. There's no surviving screenshots, production materials, or hard evidence of the Memento Mori build existing at all. Whether you believe this build is legitimate or not is up to you, but as of now, it remains unconfirmed, and yet another mystery among Binding Blade's many, many lost developmental versions. Last, we have a few miscellaneous pictures from various builds of Binding Blade. These all came in at some point in the development cycle, though they're not attached to any of the builds that we know about. These pictures show the evolution of the combat screen as it shifted closer to its final version. Some screenshots show the game with darker colors in the final game, implying the color scheme was shifted later in development. There were a lot of changes made along the way before Binding Blade hit its final version, and these various pictures are proof of it. As I said before, Binding Blade had an incredibly rocky development history. It went through a lot before finally ending up on shelves in March of 2002. I would love to see how any of these various builds resurface at some point because of how much they could tell us about the development cycle. Any one of them would be fine with me, though I'm particularly interested in Space World 2001 and Maiden of Darkness out of these builds. It's my holy grail of lost media, honestly, and I hope something happens for all of this to be uncovered one day. Alright, I know you're probably sick of hearing me talk about Binding Blade by now, but there's one last piece of lost media we need to discuss before we can move on to the next few titles in the series. This is easily the most frustrating piece of lost media on this entire list in my opinion, and it's things like this that make me scream from the rooftops about how important archival is. Let's talk about the promotional DLC maps from Binding Blade, a fully lost set of 4 Fire Emblem chapters that will haunt me for the rest of my days. In 2002, there were a few promotional events that involved handing out trial maps to winners of specific contests. Any Lost Media enthusiasts will know that is already a red flag. The Japanese manga magazine V-Jump hosted a promotional event related to the Champion Sword manga, and the first 3 maps came from this. Said 3 maps were Grisel Execution Court, V-Type Original Map, and J-Type Original Map. The last map was a reward for a ranking tournament held online, and this map was simply called Defeat Bandits. In order to get these chapters, winners of the contest would have to send in their copies of Binding Blade to have the maps downloaded into the slot of a 6th trial map. As such, none of them are found in the original cartridges of the game and were instead downloaded later. The maps are also absent from the original game and the Wii U Virtual Console release of the game in Japan, making them completely inaccessible. 50 winners received the Grisel Execution Court map based on a location in the Champion Sword manga. I told you it would be back. We have a picture of this map and its layout along with a magazine scan and a sprite reconstruction from Serenus Forest. We know the most about this map, but that's not saying much. 10 winners received both the V-Type and J-Type maps, and we only have small magazine scans of both. You're never going to believe this, but they look like the letters V and J. The highest ranking winners online got the Defeat Bandits map, and there are no surviving pictures of this last chapter, making it the most obscure of the bunch. YouTube user Filbertian, I hope I pronounced that right, made a video on the subject of these lost maps to spread awareness about them, and in September of 2022, his efforts saw fruit. Another YouTube user known as Taketo Kanoko commented on the video and said they not only participated in the online ranking competition, but won one of the distributions of Defeat Bandits. They still own the cartridge too. So we should be able to get the map dumped online, right? Unfortunately not. GBA cartridges break down over time, and their batteries can eventually completely stop functioning. That is the unfortunate fate that befell Taketo Kanoko's copy of Binding Blade, leaving the data on it impossible to access and Defeat Bandits out of our reach. However, Taketo Kanoko shared what information they remembered about the map. It was 20 by 24 tiles, and had large mountains that created a diamond at the center of the map, and housed a fortress and some grass at the center of the mountain range. The player units start on the left side of the map, and the enemy army consists of sages with bolting and fortify at the center of the mountains. The other enemy classes include berserkers, wyvern lords, snipers, heroes, and more sages. There were many castles between the player's army starting point and the siege point on the other side of the mountain range. If Taketo Kanoko's information about their cartridge is any indication, it's likely most of the other cartridges with these maps have also died out over time. Chances are these maps were permanently lost long before there was even an effort to search for them. Taketo Kanoko hasn't responded to any messages since leaving this comment on Filbertian's video, but the signs aren't looking good about what happened to these 4 promotional trial maps. The fact that the contests were held in Japan, and thus all information about them is in Japanese, doesn't help either, and that language barrier is a huge issue, especially with something like this that was already obscure without that extra obstacle. At this point, our best bet of finding these lost chapters is for intelligent systems to release them directly. The cartridges with these maps are incredibly rare, and they could have deteriorated over time without the world at large ever knowing how many surviving copies are still out there. Intelligent systems must still have the data somewhere. All they need to do is release it, though it's difficult to say if they ever will. With all these pieces of Binding Blade lost media, it seems as if there's no hope for any of them to ever get recovered or archived. However, I would argue that there's more to it than that. After all, there are other pieces of previously lost media from the GBA era that were surfaced years later, and that leads us into our 2 pieces of found media for today's presentation, the prototype builds of Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones. And because I'm reading this all in one take, water break. Refreshing. Back in October of 2008, Intelligent Systems suffered a massive data leak. A lot of valuable information came to light with that leak, including 2 prototypes of Blazing Blade and 1 prototype of Sacred Stones. These are our found media for the day. They've been found for a while, so most people already know about them, but they're more than that. These prototypes are also hope that we might one day see the beta builds of Binding Blade, and they're incredibly interesting to boot. So, without further ado, let's get into them. There are 2 versions of the Blazing Blade prototype, 0206 and 0219. The numbers stand for the dates when they were developed, February 6th and 19th respectively. Both versions have given us a debug menu that was used throughout the development process, and the menu has many commands for character testing, tutorial skipping, looking at the stats screen, and more. Going over the full debug menu could probably be a panel of its own, though, so if you're interested in learning more about this, I highly suggest you look into it on your own time, since this found media is now readily available with much information online. The most interesting parts of these two beta builds are the graphics. The character graphics show us that originally, Ninian's dancer rings were scarves that are the same color as their final variation counterparts. Raven and Heath have completely different color schemes, and the final versions are definitely better for them both. The lords also have a few variations in their emotion portraits. Hector has one that doesn't even have an equivalent in the final game, and I have to wonder why it got cut. There are a lot of variations in the cutscene stills, too. In fact, all but 2 of them are different from the final game. The stills from Lin mode are closest to how they are in the final game, but a few of them saw significant changes even so, such as the final picture of the mode. Eliwood and Hector's storylines are similar up until about the halfway point. Afterward, they start shifting into more sketches that have not been colored or shaded, though they're arguably even more interesting in this state. The picture in the desert is also different from the final game, since Eliwood and Ninian have been removed from the final version. All of the art is missing the yellowish filter known as part of the Blazing Blade art style, since that was added later in development. Lastly, we have information for 2 other characters found in this build, Eleonora and Igreen. The code 02X29 is a copy of Nils in the final game, but in these prototypes, it's a copy of Eliwood's mother instead. She's oddly enough adjacent to all the playable characters, and the version of her in the final game has growth rates even though she only appears in cutscenes. Maybe she was going to be playable at one point. I'm not sure. As for Igreen, she's in slot 0x2b, and she's a bit strange. 0x2b is a duplicate of Vida in the final game, but in the prototypes, it's Igreen. Her weapon ranks are A in swords, S in lances, and C in axes. But she starts as an archer. Her affinity is anima here, even though it was ice and binding blade. This is highly inaccurate to the Igreen we know, so I imagine that if she was going to appear, it would have only been for a single cutscene. Sacred Stones has a found prototype as well, though there's only one for this game as opposed to 2 in Binding Blade. Once again, this prototype has a very expansive debug feature that I won't be covering here, but there's a lot to be found for anyone interested in game development. I wanted to mention it for the sake of completeness, even if I won't be talking about it in depth. There are a lot of portrait differences between the prototype and the final version, so I'm only going to highlight the most notable changes. Mulder's clothing completely changed for one. Ford's hair used to be spikier, and he was actually the green Christmas Cavalier where Kyle was red, though this was swapped in the final game. Beta Larashell used Tana's design, though she was given a new look for the final game. The same happened with Tethys and Naimi. Tethys originally had Naimi's design, but she received a new sprite, while her old design was given to Naimi. Another changed graphic comes in the form of the victory screen in the Tower of Volney. That's very obviously a placeholder. Thank the Sacred Stones themselves for this getting changed later. It's kind of an eyesore. The world map is different between the prototype and final versions, too. Sacred Stones maps are in various states of completion in this version of the game. Some of them are a lot further along than others, to say the least. The Lagdo ruins in particular are kind of messy. Some of them function perfectly when you open them, others crash when you try to open them, and others look like that. Yikes. Other maps changed fundamentally between the beta and final versions. For example, the original draft of Chapter 6 was moved to Chapter 11 of Erica's route, while a new map was made for Chapter 6. Chapter 7 used to be Fog of War too, and I think we're all happy that's not the case anymore. The Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones prototypes show us a lot when it comes to the behind-the-scenes development process for these two games. They're honestly lost media gold mines, and I'm so happy they were found. I hope we can see other games in their beta forms in the future. We need more found media gold mines to talk about with Fire Emblem, and this definitely fits the bill. It's a shame that hasn't happened to any other games. And another water break. On that note, we move out of the GBA era next and into the Tellius duology. There are 3 pieces of lost media from this era to round out the 2000s decade, and the first and second are heavily intertwined. First off, we have the early builds of Path of Radiance from the game's development period, and all of these builds are fully lost. Path of Radiance had a much easier time in development than Binding Blade, so there are fewer beta builds, and the changes between them are far less dramatic than anything in Binding Blade's versions. Before we go any further, though, I would like to clear up a quick misconception. No, Path of Radiance was never planned for the N64. Many people have seen beta pictures of this game and assumed the pictures were from an earlier console since they don't look as crisp as the final game. However, Path of Radiance's entire developmental lifetime took place on the GameCube from 2003 to 2005. Before even the GameCube version of the game, though, we had a mock-up of Ike fighting an enemy soldier. Due to the many strange facts about this image, such as the enemy being stated to wield a lance while holding a sword, and the impossibly low hit and critical rates for killer weapons, it is believed to be a mock-up rather than an actual screenshot. This is from very early in development, and the oldest known picture we have of Path of Radiance. In this picture, Ike is called Paris, a name that was later reused in Awakening, though English-speaking fans know this character as Priam. Using Ike's beta name for his descendant is Sneaky Intelligent Systems. I see you there. As for the actual build, it seems to come from about April 2000. As for the first actual build, it comes from about April of 2004. This build had 2 maps, but we only have screenshots of one. The map is very simplistic and matches nothing in the game. It contains a handful of playable characters: Ike, Soren, Rolf, Titania, Reese, Leith, Marcia, and Zyhark against Daean soldiers. The battle sequences take place on a zoomed-in version of the map, and all of the enemies use the same generic fighter model. The stat screen looks very different from the final game, as we can see here with Titania. The background of the stat screen has a picture of the Tower of Guidance from Benyon 2. You can see a few small differences in Titania's sprite here, though it's rather similar to the final version overall. One screenshot depicts a conversation between Leith and Soren, and the translation of it can be found online if you're interested in looking it up. An updated version of this build was made playable at E3 in May of 2004, but it has never resurfaced since then. Next up, we move to November of 2004, and Nintendo Touch World DS events across Japan. There were kiosks all across the country that had beta versions of Path of Radiance for people to play. At the time, the game was slated for a winter 2004 release, though this was later pushed back to the final release of April 2005. We have pictures of the build from this promotional event as well, and it's the next version of Path of Radiance. This demo contained a version of Chapter 1 for players to enjoy, though it was subtly different from the final game. More notably, this demo looks a lot more like the final version than the E3 build. There is one large difference here, though, and that would be Ike's personal weapon. In the final game, it is known as the Regal Sword, and he gets it in Chapter 4. In this demo, Ike has the sword in Chapter 1, but it's not known as the Regal Sword yet. Instead, the blade is called the Long Sword. This actually makes a lot of sense, given the fact that the Regal Sword is referred to as IID_Longsword internally, meaning the rename to Regal Sword was probably one of the last changes made to the game. All speculation aside, Ike got his first personal weapon a lot sooner in this build of the game. As for the other changes in this version of the game, we can see them in a few screenshots published in Nintendo Dream around the time of the promotion event. The HP bar in this build looks a lot more elaborate than the final game, and looks more like what would be later seen in Radiant Dawn. The stat screen used to have Lagoo's dual numbers on every character instead of just Lagoo's. The Bjork icon on the stat screen is still a placeholder and has yet to be inserted. For a very minor detail, Soren used to have 2 fewer points of HP than he does in the final game. Our last build has the least information about it, since the pictures come from an unidentified promo reel that includes footage from a beta version of the game. This build could be older than we know, but since we don't know the age of the screenshots, we can only assume the build is from the time when the pictures first surfaced, January 2005. The HP bars are still very elaborate, and if you ask me, this build probably came in between the first 2 I've discussed because of how similarly the HP bars, how much similarity the HP bars have with the Touch World demo. The battle screens also had hit rate, damage, and critical rate and combat animations, something notably missing from both the final game and the Touch World demo, once again reinforcing the idea of this build being somewhere in between the E3 and Touch World builds. Aside from that, the only major difference comes in the form of the level-up screens that look far less elaborate than the final version. So, in short, we have 3 known builds of Path of Radiance: E3 2004, Touch World 2004, and an unidentified build that first came to light in January 2005, but is probably older than that. Beyond that, 2 of these lost builds have demos. And those demos are our next piece of lost media. Not only are these builds all lost media, but the demos that come with them haven't resurfaced in almost 20 years either. Nobody has seen the E3 or Touch World demo since 2004, making the beta builds of Path of Radiance something of a 2-in-1 bonus. Not only are the builds missing, but the demos are as well. There's one more demo for Path of Radiance too, though this one comes from 2005. This is the only demo to be shown in English rather than Japanese, and it was shown at E3 in 2005. This demo was for the English version of Path of Radiance and contained chapters 13 and 16 on the easiest difficulty. The cutscene voices were still in Japanese, but the text was all in English. Once again, this demo hasn't been seen since 2005. So that makes for 3 lost demos of Path of Radiance, and I have no idea where to search for any of them aside from asking Intelligent Systems directly, though I doubt they'd ever release any of these builds. I'd love to see how any of the beta versions of this game were, but for now, all we have are pictures and long-gone demo periods for E3 2004, Touch World 2004, and E3 2005. I said before that there were 3 pieces of Tellius lost media, but that's only partially true. Our final piece of lost media from the 2000s and from the Tellius era is only sort of related to the games in question. Let's talk about the fully lost Wii tech demo developed in the late 2000s. Fire Emblem Wii was an expansive game and a very experimental one developed after Radiant Dawn's release. Most people didn't even know the game was being made until well after it had completed development. Most information we have about this game once again comes from the Making of Fire Emblem book. You thought we were done with that after Maiden of Darkness? Nope. It's a goldmine of series history and apparently lost media. The Wii tech demo was set to be a massive departure from series tradition. Rather than being a turn-based strategy game, it was going to be a real-time strategy game similar to Pikmin. The game has a mode simply called Field that involves controlling a group of characters through NPC interaction, enemy encounters, and free exploration. Some of these exploration segments led to places like towns, buildings, and caves. When a player encountered an enemy, an icon would appear to initiate combat with said enemy. The camera was in third person but could be altered by the player, though we know little about this aside from the camera being able to zoom in and out. As for how all of this relates to Tellius, Stefan, Ileana, and Reese all appear in the concept art for this game. It's unknown if these are placeholder sketches or if this actually had something to do with Tellius, though. In other words, this is halfway a piece of Tellius lost media. Consider it a bonus on top of the 2 we already have, for 2.5 lost medias about Tellius. We were never meant to know for sure what this game had to do with Tellius, though. In fact, the game was never meant to be released. It was experimental and lacked ideas and objectives, leading to the project being permanently shelved, though we don't know how far along it was before it was left by the wayside. It's also unknown as to if there are any builds surviving to this day. Maybe Intelligent Systems, Nintendo, or even just an employee is holding on to it. We don't know for sure. There is one interesting fact about this game, though, and it lives on in Echoes of all games. The exploration concept was reused in Echoes, and the map found in the concept art of Fire Emblem Wii looks a lot like the explorable maps from that game. In some ways, the spirit of Fire Emblem Wii survives even all these years later, though that only makes the game more interesting to me. I would love to see what a real-time Fire Emblem game would be like, though I somehow doubt we're ever going to see this game dumped online or otherwise archived. We didn't even know it existed until years after it had been shelved. It's a shame. Imagine what a lost media holy grail this could be. Water break. Hydrate, everybody. Alright. Next up, I have a more recent piece of lost media and our first venture into the 2010s decade. Fire Emblem Cypher was a card game for the Fire Emblem franchise that started in 2015 before being cancelled 5 years later in 2020. I'll miss you every day, Cypher. The cards had art made by a variety of artists depicting characters from across the series' timeline. Most of the art from Cypher has been documented, but there are a few exceptions to that rule, leading to Cypher's art being considered partially lost. When it comes to finding this art, I believe it would be fully possible, albeit a bit tedious. It would be best done as a community effort in which a group went through every Cypher card ever released and double-checked to see if we had the original versions of the art. Most of the time, these pictures were uploaded online following the deck they belonged to being released. For those that only exist in low quality or have never been released on their own, the community would need to get in contact with those artists to ask them for the high-quality uploads. Like I said before, a strong majority of the Cypher art has already been uploaded online, and the best source to see it all in one place is Effie Cypher Full Art. Oh, Artful, my bad, page on Tumblr. It's just a matter of getting everything else found that hasn't been posted so that we can have a complete collection of all the art from this game. The 2010s were a great decade for Fire Emblem lost media preservation. As the community grew, so too did the effort to ensure everything was accounted for when it came to new content. As such, the only media that hasn't been well documented is that which hasn't been released, like the Cypher card art that was never posted in full online. This next piece of media also falls into that category, though it's a bit of a mystery as to if its full version even exists. Fire Emblem Three Houses had a vocal song recorded for its soundtrack. Said song came to be known as The Edge of Dawn. This song was recorded in Japanese and English for both the original and international releases of the game. But there was one more version of the song too. There was a Korean dub of The Edge of Dawn that was released on YouTube in 2019. Well, a clip that's a little bit over a minute long was put online. That's where the mystery of this lost media comes in. The obvious next question is as follows. Is there a full version of the song? We're not entirely sure, making this a case of existence unconfirmed media. If there is a full version, then it's lost media and has never been released or spoken of. We have no way of knowing for sure if a full version exists, though, since there's never been any talk of it existing, and the full song was never released in Korean. I'm not sure how much we could get confirmation about this either, as much as I hate to admit it. Right now, it's just a small, puzzling case about if there's any lost media to be found here or not. As I said before, there isn't much Fire Emblem lost media from the 2010s because of active community efforts to archive everything. We don't have any manga mysteries like we did the first 6 games, since all the 4 Kalmar releases starting with Awakening have been archived in countless places. Everything that has been released publicly has been easily preserved, so once again, we have a piece of media that was never released publicly. In fact, there's debate as to if it even exists to begin with. There were rumors going around in 2019 about there being a second planned Fire Emblem remake set to release on the 3DS after Three Houses. This all started with EmblemCon, a former senior editor at Game Informer, saying on the Kinda Funny Games Daily podcast that a second remake was in development for the 3DS but was scrapped. This came on the heels of the announcement that Alpha Dream, the developer for the Mario and Luigi series, was filing for bankruptcy. The cause and effect here is interesting. It seems as if the crash caused by the 3DS remake of Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story had a massive ripple effect throughout Nintendo. For a long time, Nintendo was trying to balance the Switch and the 3DS as a simultaneous home console and handheld console pair. After the massive financial failure of the Bowser's Inside Story remake, Nintendo started working to wind down the 3DS's lifespan. As proof of this, the eShop was permanently closed just a few months ago. So what does this mean for the rumored 3DS remake? Well, chances are the project was scrapped and moved to the Switch, just as EmblemCon claimed. Nintendo knew new games would sell better on the Switch, so they decided to switch gears. Pun fully intended. All of this seems very plausible, but you can see the banner at the top of the slide. This is all still rumored, and the existence of this piece of media is unconfirmed. And a few rumors aren't hard evidence. Who's to say this remake actually exists? There's a lot of evidence for it, actually, and that leads us to our next piece of existence unconfirmed media, and the final piece of media we'll be discussing today. But first, get another water break, because this is a lot of talking. Alright, that should be the last one, I hope. Let's go back a few years, specifically to 2017, the year Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia was released. Echoes marked the start of a new trend in Fire Emblem games with the way they referred to themselves internally. Before Echoes, games referred to themselves as FE and then a number based on their position in the series. So, for example, Binding Blade was FE6. Echoes started to call itself Iron 15, though, a reference to how Iron's abbreviation on the periodic table is FE. This trend has continued ever since then. Echoes is Iron 15, Heroes is Iron 16, Three Houses is Iron 17, and Engage is Iron 19. Wait, what? Yeah, that's right. Engage refers to itself internally as the 19th game in the series. That's odd, isn't it? They skipped the number 18. And Project Iron 18 is our last piece of lost media. It's also, at least in my opinion, compelling evidence for what the next Fire Emblem game is going to be, though I do want to emphasize that this is all just my personal speculation, no hard evidence. So, what do we know about the game right now? According to EmblemCon, a second remake of an old Fire Emblem game was being developed for the 3DS at the same time as Three Houses. Since Three Houses was a joint venture with Koei Tecmo, it's not at all out of the wild to think Intelligent Systems could have divided its attention. Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance were developed at the same time, after all. At the time, Nintendo was still trying to balance both the 3DS and Switch, so it would make sense if they followed up on their previous audience for Fire Emblem on the 3DS with yet another remake. And that was when Bowser's Inside Story completely crashed and burned. Nintendo didn't want another financial disaster like that, so all attention from the 3DS was turned to the Switch, canceling the Fire Emblem remake in the blink of an eye. Just like that, Iron 18 was killed and swept under the rug before the general public even knew it existed. However, the project was revived on the Switch, and that's where we arrive in the present. All of this only becomes more interesting with the knowledge revealed in an interview about Engage earlier this year. The game was supposed to be a celebration of the series' history released in 2020 for the 30th anniversary, but due to the pandemic, that didn't happen. Instead, we got the English translation of Shadow Dragon as a somewhat haphazard replacement, and Engage was pushed back until its release in 2023. Rumors circulated months before the game's announcement that Intelligent Systems was hiding a fully finished Fire Emblem game, and these rumors came with pictures of Engage. Every fact in that leak turned out to be true. Engage was finished for ages since it was meant to be an anniversary project that was postponed by the pandemic, and it was held off until the proper moment to give Three Hopes breathing room after its June 2022 release. There's one other fact in that leak that I find interesting, though. The rumors of a Genealogy of the Holy War remake coming soon. Given how accurate the leak was about every detail related to Engage, it feels like this is where the series is headed. It makes a lot of sense with the Unknown 3DS remake and Iron 18 story too. The remake of Genealogy started its life on the 3DS, but was scrapped in early 2019. This would have put the game as starting development after Three Houses, a game known for its numerous delays throughout development, but before Engage. That remake was moved to the Switch, and that's where we stay now, waiting for Project Iron 18 to release. As for miscellaneous evidence pointing to this, Engage's DLC was a lot faster than any other game before it. For example, Fire Emblem Warriors came out in October of 2017. Its DLC cycle ended 5 months later, in March 2018. Three Houses released in July 2019, and its last wave of DLC came out 7 months after that, in February 2020. Engage came out in January 2023. And its DLC cycle finished less than 2.5 months later in April, half the time of Fire Emblem Warriors. It feels like they're rushing through this. Almost like they're trying to get ready for the new game. Also, before any of you say I sound ridiculous and that Iron 18 could just be Three Hopes, that is not the case. Three Hopes refers to itself internally as Seasons and is not considered a mainline game in its code. Iron 18 is not Three Hopes, and this mysterious project remains unaccounted for. So, what does all of this mean? I can say with 95% certainty that the next Fire Emblem game is going to be a remake of Genealogy of the Holy War, and it'll probably be announced later this year or sometime early next year. Iron 18 probably won't be existence unconfirmed media forever. Give it a few months and come back to me. I bet I know exactly where this is going, and when that day comes, Iron 18 may finally see the light of day after all these years, confirming its existence and releasing to the public in one fell swoop. But that's just a theory. A game theory! Bad joke. Jokes and speculation aside, I feel like we can't address Lost Media without tackling the massive elephant in the room. The closure of the eShop. Nintendo announced the closure of the eShop last year, and they followed through with it at the end of March earlier this year. Back when the closure was first declared, there were a lot of Fire Emblem fans worried the DLC content for the 3DS games would become Lost Media. Revelation was a particular concern, and countless Reddit posts were made about that very fear. But as I've said numerous times before, the 3DS era of games is very well documented, and everything fully released has been archived. The eShop closure doesn't mean much for Fire Emblem specifically as long as you're willing to get your hands a bit dirty in the waters of piracy. But I'm not just thinking about Fire Emblem here. There are a lot of other games on the eShop for both the Wii U and 3DS that could have become lost with the closure of the eShop, and we won't know about it until it's too late. We're already too late, as a matter of fact. This is why archival is so important. We need to do everything we can to preserve the media we have at our disposal to ensure nothing goes completely missing. Lost media is honestly a pretty tragic thing. These pieces of media that people work so hard on have gone missing because of factors likely out of their control. And when it comes to the eShop's closure, it's due to a corporation giving up on archival. The lost media community is doing an admirable thing to find that which has gone missing, and every new effort to help with these searches does a lot. We deserve to preserve our history for the sake of the past, present, and future. We need to archive our media, and we need to work together to do it. It's for that very reason that this presentation is being uploaded on YouTube now. The last thing I want is for my presentation about lost media to ironically become lost media itself, so I'm going to do what I can to preserve it. My previous 2 informational EmblemCon panels, the cut content of Fire Emblem and the glitches of Fire Emblem, are also on YouTube for anyone who is curious. Consider it me doing my part for the sake of archival. We need to do everything we can to archive media. And while the closure of the eShop is a blow, it doesn't have to be the end. There's a community around lost media for a reason, and we need to work together to preserve the media we see. That's the only way we'll be able to keep all of this held close going forward. It all starts with you. All of you. So I have to ask, what will you do? Okay, that was a long one, and my throat definitely agrees. Still, I thank you all for joining me on this journey into Fire Emblem Lost Media. I hope you learned something and maybe gained a passion for Lost Media along the way. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and it taught me a lot about this series of games I love so much. This has been Digital Dreams, and I'll see you in a few months for that Genealogy remake. If you want to hear anything more from me, you can check out my social media as seen on the screen, and thank you all for watching.